In this tutorial, I want to show you how you can apply some of the techniques that we've already covered in previous videos in this series when you're improvising in 16th notes rather than 8th notes. This is really difficult to do. You've got to think at lightning speed, and you really do need to know the scales, the modes to use, and lots of little cliche patterns that are used over and over again in jazz to be able to keep going, quite fluently. So the first thing we're going to revise is the use of bebop scales. What are bebop scales and why are they useful? Well, remember, a bebop scale is an ordinary scale. For instance, a C major scale with one added chromatic passing note, in this case between the G and the A, the 5th and the 6th note of the major scale. And then there's a bebop dominant scale, which is a mixolydian mode with one added chromatic passing note. So let's just revise what a mixolydian mode is. It's when you start a major scale on the 5th degree of that scale, for instance, C major, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to play the notes of a C major scale, but starting on G. And what we've got there is a G mixolydian mode, and that's the kind of default mode to play when you're improvising over a G7 chord. And once again, the added note, the added chromatic passing note, is between the G and the F. So why are these scales useful? Well, if you start your improvised line on a downbeat, and you start the line on a chord note, and if you're playing in either 8th notes or 16th notes, you're always going to land on another chord note on every downbeat, which makes it flow along very smoothly. So for instance, if I played a little passage, I started with beat 1, the 3rd of a C major chord. Beat 2, I went on to the root. On beat 3, the 6th, and in beat 4, I was on the 3rd. So every time you land on a chord note. Okay, now in the introduction, I played a couple of lines over what we call a 1-6-2-5 chord progression. This is a really standard chord progression used in jazz. And it simply means the diatonic chords that you form on the 1st degree of a scale, the 6th, the 2nd, and the 7th. So the 4 chords are C major 6, A minor 7, that's chord 6, D minor 7, chord 2, G7, chord 5. So I'm going to revoice those and play them down here. 1, 6, 2, 5. Now, on the 1 and the 6, I'm going to use the same scale. I'm going to use the bebop major scale on C. So why does that scale work on both of those chords? Well, if we look at a C major 6 chord, take the A from the top and put it at the bottom, we have an A minor 7 chord. So in other words, the two chords contain the same note. They are pretty well interchangeable. When you're improvising over a 1-6-2-5, you've got to remember that really you're playing a sort of 1-5 chord progression, but with a couple of substitute chords. So in other words, if you had, say, a bar of C6, 1, 2, 3, 4, going on to G7, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can always substitute that with 1, 2 on C6, 3, 4 on A minor 7, 1, 2 on D minor 7, and 3, 4 and G7. Now, you're probably thinking, right, well, yeah, C6 and A minor 7 contain the same notes. How come that D minor 7 doesn't have the same notes as G7? No, but if you played a D minor 7 chord with G in the bass, you would get what we call a suspended fourth chord. That note, C, is the suspended fourth, which wants to resolve to the third, or its other name is simply a G11 chord, the C being 11 notes above the root G. So we use, as I said, we use the major bebop scale starting on C for both chord 1 and chord 6, and we use the bebop dominant scale for both chord 2 and chord 5. Now, I know another thing that's very confusing is you think, well, hang on a second. First of all, you said that the reason that the bebop scales work so well, it's because if you start on a chord note on a downbeat, you're always going to land on another chord note on a downbeat when you're playing in 8th notes or 16th note. That doesn't seem to apply to D minor 7. No, that's true. But as I say, the reason is it's the different context. You are thinking of the D minor 7 really as being a substitute for the G7, and we're keeping the same chord progression. You could think, and I'm asked this question a lot, say, well, right, if A minor 7 uses the same scale as C major 6 in a 1, 6, 2, 5 chord progression, you could say, well, D minor 7 contains the same notes as F major 6. Why don't we use a bebop major scale starting on F? There, I've put the chromatic passing note in between the 5th note of an F major scale. Okay, well, if you did that, let's say you're going from D minor 7 to G7 and you did a little passage like this. You've landed on C, which clashes very badly with the B in the G7 chord. Whereas if you played the bebop dominant scale, starting in the same place, you would go. So when you get to G7 there, you're landing on D, which is a chord note. Okay, so the bebop scale makes it much easier for you to think very quickly when you're improvising over a chord, because you, as long as you start the improvised passage on a chord note on a downbeat, as I say, you're always going to land on a downbeat with a chord note. When you change from one chord to another, that's when you might have your problem though. For instance, if I was going from A minor 7 to D minor 7, and you did something like this. I've landed on E on the D minor 7 chord. Now, in actual fact, that particular note doesn't really clash. It's the 9th. That sounds really nice. None of the notes of a D Dorian mode, which is the default scale for a minor 7, actually clash at all. However, it's when you get onto the G7. So what you've got to do is play up the Dorian mode. So let's go back to the A minor 7. Now, if you just go up the Dorian mode and then come back one there, we've now landed on a G, which is one of the chord notes in the G7 chord. So we can now play the bebop dominant scale from G7. And then when we get to G7, then we've landed on a chord note. So couldn't go straight onto the bebop dominant scale having landed on E, because if you did, you would have done this. You would have ended up with non-chord notes on the downbeat. You would have ended up there, which obviously is going to clash badly with the D minor 7 or with the G7. So if you land on a non-chord note when you're changing chord, this is one of the solutions, just to play up the ordinary mode. So if it was a major chord, that would be the major scale. A minor 7 chord, you usually play the Dorian mode, and a mixolydian on the dominant 7th chord, and until you land on a chord note on a downbeat, and then you resume playing the bebop scale. Now, what to do if you forget to go back into the bebop scale? For instance, the example that we've just done, where we said we'd go up the notes of a D Dorian mode and then back down on the bebop dominant scale, so you land on a chord note on G7. Let's say you forgot to do it. You just came down the notes of the Dorian mode, and all of a sudden, oh no, we've landed on C on the G7 chord. Well, don't panic. Just go straight onto the next chord note, but make that a syncopated note like this. Okay, and then all of a sudden it seems to work. That's fine. Now, what do we do just here? Because we want to land on the E. We've already talked about this in previous ones. Just put a chromatic note below it. So that's a cliche that you really need to know. Another one is going, missing the F sharp, going straight to the F, the 7th, down to the 5th of G7, and then the chromatic note there. Again, that's a cliche that you really need to know. Okay, chromatic scales can be really useful when you're improvising in 16th notes. And a particular place that you often want to use chromatic passing notes is when you're starting on the 3rd note of a bebop scale. So for instance, if you're on a C6 chord or an A minor 7 chord and you're starting on E, you could just do straight down the bebop scale. But you can also put a little bit of a chromatic scale in there. The same thing works on the dominant bebop scale. If you start on the 3rd note of that, again, if you're on G7, the bebop scale obviously works absolutely fine, but equally so, you can go chromatic scale to begin with, because you're still landing on a chord note there. And again, that's a little pattern that you really do need to know. If you land on the 3rd of a scale, a bebop scale, you can always put that bit of a chromatic scale in. Another one is if you find yourself landing on the 2nd note rather of a bebop scale. Say you're on C6 and you suddenly find, say you've come from another chord and you've landed on D, just put a chromatic passing note in between that, the D and the C. It would work equally well if you were on A minor 7. And then just carry on with the bebop scale. Another little thing that we've looked at in previous videos is when you're on the dominant chord, when you land on either the 3rd, say of G7, or the 5th, or the 7th, you can then use a diminished arpeggio. So if you go, for instance, you land on the D, you can go straight onto a diminished 7th arpeggio. And the reason for that, remember, is that this diminished 7th chord, if you add a G below it, you get a G7 with a flat 9th. So you can use that diminished arpeggio or that one, because they all contain the same notes. You can, of course, just use simple arpeggios, for instance, A minor 7 going to D minor 7, just go up the notes of an A minor 7 chord, leading you very nicely to the 3rd F of D minor 7. You can do the same thing, but instead of starting on the A, displace the A up an octave, still leads you to the same place. The 3rd of the next chord, whenever you're going in cycle progressions down a 5th, is always a good one to aim for, and to come from the 7th of the previous chord is always good. You can use what I call chord progressions within a chord. For instance, you could use an E minor 7 arpeggio going on to the 3rd of A minor 7, and then continue with just an ordinary A minor 7 arpeggio, leading you once again to the 3rd of D minor 7. So why does that work? Well, if you look at the notes of E minor 7, E is the 5th of A minor 7, G the 7th, B is the 9th, and D is the 11th. So it's got a strong feeling of forward motion, because E minor 7 going to A minor 7 is a chord progression of down a 5th. So even though you're not actually changing the chord, you're on an A minor 7 chord, the improvised line kind of implies a change there, and it gives that feeling of propelling it forward. Okay, let's have a look now at what I played in the introduction. First of all, I started the first line on the and after 1, not on a downbeat, but on beat 2 on the downbeat, I made sure that I landed on a chord note, E, the 3rd of C6, on the downbeat, and I then played an E minor 7 arpeggio. Now, I've just been talking about using that arpeggio over A minor 7. It works equally well over C major, because if we think of it as C major 7 now rather than C6, we've got the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th of C major 7. I then came back to the C. Now remember, we're now on an A minor 7 chord, and I just went down the notes of the major bebop scale until I got to G. But then I did something different. I played a diminished 7th chord. Now you're probably straight away thinking, yeah, hang on, we're on A minor 7. Why on earth are we playing a diminished 7th chord? Because I've put a chord substitution, a secondary dominant. On beat 4, I've changed A minor 7 to A7, taking you nicely to D minor 7. And G is the 7th of A7. And as you know, on a dominant 7th chord, if you're on the 3rd, the 5th or 7th, you can play a diminished 7th arpeggio. And that led very nicely to the 3rd of D minor 7, F. I then just did a little arpeggio, went down to the 5th, back up to the 7th and the 9th, and then reverse direction, went on to the root. Now the left hand, you notice I'm playing F sharp there, which again makes it actually feel like a chord substitution, like D7. You can think of it like that. When you're playing a walking bass, you can always approach the root of the following chord from a semitone above or below, and you don't really need to think too much about, you know, what chord that's making it. But I then use this little jazz cliche, which you just really need to know. You just go, we're aiming to land on B, the third of G7. So you just go, you kind of circle around it. And then I use the chromatic scale that I was talking about. This is the third of G7. And then, once again, bebop scale. But I want to land on E on the downbeat, so I put the chromatic approach note below it. I could have gone, which is what I actually did in the second example. So in the second example, I used this little idea, which is where you approach each chord note, the root, the third and the seventh, the root, the third and the fifth, from the note above it in the scale, and then play the chord note itself, go to a semitone below and come back up. Oscar Peterson did that ever such a lot. Now, in this case, I missed the first one out. So, now on the last bit, just there, again, I put the diminished seventh chord. And then I did a little syncopated rhythm there. Once again, you hear the, so, and yet again. So that one's a kind of essential little pattern to know. Okay, I think that's about covered all the things we did. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.